Friday, August 30th, 2024. Costello woke up to a text from Avery. She took a look at the map and realized after putting in a few extra hours the night before, he could take a short trip into Ludlow and then one final big push into Needles before closing out California and moving into Arizona. He found a nice breakfast spot in Calico, so he was fully on board with this plan. He remembered his first letter from Avery was to be opened before crossing the state line into Arizona. He opened it and found a short message of genuine congratulatory inspiration and instructions not to open the next letter until just before he gets into the Appalachians. Something Avery didn't mention in her text or letter was she made plans to visit Costello's mom in Ojai. While Costello was pedaling through Arizona en route to Gallup, New Mexico, Avery decided to establish a relationship with his mother. Instead of throwing him off his pace by telling him she was doing this, Avery decided it best to keep it between her and Candace. They spoke about this a great deal because both were concerned Costello may see this omission as a bit of betrayal. But in the end, they saw his success with the tour as a priority. On day 3 through Arizona, Costello hinted to Avery he noticed a change in her communication with him. All those years bartending never left him, and he was at times a wizard at picking up on communicative clues from people. Avery wanted so badly to talk about what she was learning from Candace. She was such an open book. It was too easy for Costello to notice the change in her tone, pitch, and the new pauses she'd developed suddenly. Fortunately for her, the cycling through Arizona was a bitch, so he was wiped out most nights they spoke, and he never really pushed her to come clean. Avery knew she was being extraordinarily deceptive by cultivating a relationship with Candace. Although she ran the numbers and determined what she would build in the process outweighed any risk. Her assessment garnered more than she expected. Costello not spending much time with his mom, or even talking about her much, misguided Avery to think that she would learn more about a broken mother-son relationship than she wound up discovering. The first time Avery spent with Candace was a Sunday brunch in Ojai, where they both found each other endearing. Avery was astounded to find out Candace knew absolutely nothing about Jenna. She literally had no idea who Avery postulated. Costello kept their relationship on a need-to-know basis and flat-out omitted the darkest aspect of their history together. Avery found it best to leave that secret for Costello to fill in the blanks. Candace respected her choice to change the subject, and Avery saw a glow in her, as though she would have made the same decision and felt a kindredness among them. Avery was internally torn about how she made her connection with Candace, because she felt as though using updates of Costello's tour was a ruse. It certainly wasn't a ruse, especially since Candace said Costello would probably contact her a handful of times as he crossed the nation on a bicycle. Avery was just rummaging through her brain trying to figure out why she felt horrible about her scheme, even though it looked as though, without a doubt, it was the right thing to do. The bit of insight she learned of Costello was the history he had with a piano teacher when he lived in New Hampshire. Candace eventually welcomed Avery to her home, where she showcased a beautiful grand piano in her study. It was passed down from Candace's mother, who apparently played well enough to be invited to join an orchestra in Portsmouth, though she never played outside of her home while suffering from stage fright. Candace emphasized her skepticism about it being just stage fright. She firmly believed her mother battled severe anxiety and mild agoraphobia. These diagnoses were rarely made during this time. She often found her mother conjuring up excuses to avoid social gatherings and eventually learned to follow suit by collecting reasons her mother would be absent from most everything. She talked about how the sound that came from the piano more than compensated for her mother not being more engaged with the public. This was her stance as a child and young adult. She looks back now and holds a heavy heart for everything her mother missed. When she passed away, the piano was left to Candace, who never carried on the tradition of sending vibration into the universe with her hands. Costello, on the other hand, he gravitated towards the piano. Sadly, he wasn't quite as talented as his grandmother. He didn't let that keep him from pounding the keys any chance he had. Candace grabbed a bottle of wine and 2 glasses in preparation for telling Avery a very personal fact about Costello and his time playing the piano. She talked about how he played the keys quite gingerly. He didn't actually pound the keys. He knew he wasn't some savant who would wind up being a paid musician. However, he affixed himself to the piano as though it were providing oxygen for the household. Most know when he was living in New Hampshire, he never developed any hobbies. No sports, no recreational activities, no chess club, etc., etc. The piano was a touchstone when he wasn't doing homework or chores. One day, he informed Candace a girl always sat atop the piano and kept him company. Candace thought maybe it was her mother. He made it very clear it was a younger girl, and based on photographs, it wasn't his grandmother, even when she was younger. Candace chalked it up to his aloof and isolated behavior. So many kids develop imaginary friends, and so long as he was content, she figured what was the harm. She expressed regret for never taking him to a therapist to discuss the behavior. As time progressed, it was as though his imaginary friend became highly suggestive about him staying indoors rather frequently. Candace didn't pull any punches. She talked about his bouts with agoraphobia and alcoholism and displayed regret for not being more actively involved in seeking him help. She wept some as she validated her actions through the evidence of his constant success and ways of finding the drive he needed to meet his goals. Avery began to process this information, and everything was suddenly clicking. She found comfort in knowing he had somehow assimilated to his schizophrenia, even as a young boy. She felt this way until Candace continued. Candace talked about a day around the holidays when Costello was becoming a teenager and expressing his emotion about his father being infrequently present. He shut the piano and asked her to sit with him. She sat immediately. Her young boy addressed her with adult language and with a bravado-laden cadence. Candace didn't recognize her son, or who was speaking through him. She sat quietly and listened. Costello told her he felt older at times and younger others. He always felt loved and safe, while praising his mother for being a wonderful provider and addressing his father's lack thereof. He ran his hands across the piano and told her it had an energy he didn't understand, and he would seek that energy elsewhere if the piano were ever gone. When they moved from New Hampshire to California, the piano couldn't come. It wasn't fit for travel or their new home. Candace never forgot that day he told her about the energy. She reached out to relatives and asked them to store the piano until she would be able to bring it close to Costello again. In 2017, after winning her lawsuit, she built a garage in her first home in Ojai specifically to house the piano. She had it shipped and kept it covered until she finished building her current home, where it is now showcased in the study. She was hesitant to tell Avery, but on some nights, while the piano was covered in the garage, she could hear Miles Davis playing. When this family heirloom finally made it into her new home, it gave her solitude being closer to Costello and there anytime he wanted to come sit down with it and his friends. Avery sat quietly in amazement as she absorbed a story that would be laughed out of the room. She has seen Costello make the connection to this piano. Sure, the story has holes in it that could be seen as a ruse. But knowing Costello, and now knowing Candace, she felt it best leaving well enough alone. Especially since Costello is currently alone somewhere in New Mexico taking psychedelics that she suggested. She has always been an advocate for personal spirituality, but stopped short of the paranormal. She was about to make a choice as to whether or not it was time for her to respect the paranormal. Needles to Seligman simply sailed, and Costello rode just north of the Juniper Mountains. The sky not only looked different, it had a sensory to it at times. He couldn't quit gazing into the horizon. Much as he tried to log the experience in his cerebral database, He knew the words weren't going to give his visions justice. It almost felt like his cranks were spinning via centripetal force. His gaze into the Arizona abyss helped to bifurcate his cerebral from his physical. The microdosing seemed to be highly effective. He wasn't interacting with people so much, so it was hard to tell if his interpersonal relations were benefiting from the plant medicine, but his personal experiences were compelling and remarkable. Seligman to Flagstaff was just as stunning. The weather was spectacular. Sure, it was warmer than he'd like, but sometimes the environment can tame the weather, no matter how inclement. He was hoping this would continue once he tripped through Oklahoma, Missouri, and West Virginia. Only time would tell. Flagstaff to Holbrook was when he started to dip into a low. He'd been chatting with Avery and still noticing her change in intonation. He was suspicious of whatever was going on, and the airport in Holbrook would be his first real test of whether or not he would stick his commitment to the tour. Nothing like pedaling straight towards an airport when you know you've barely put a dent on a cycling tour that has the potential of tormenting you. His next leg was Holbrook to Manuelito. It was a long trip, but would leave a short trip to Gallup and then into Blue Water. He needed the 2 big bursts with short days in between before heading into Texas. Blue Water to Los Lunas was a 16-hour trip, so Costello had to find an outdoor spot to camp. He was much more comfortable with this idea, so we planned on pedaling until he felt like stopping. He'd then target Los Lunas and then a short trip into Amarillo, Texas. His plan to bust through the northern region of Texas and head into Oklahoma was working out great. He asked Avery if he could increase his dosage because the peaks of the psilocybin tamed his thoughts. She gave him the thumbs up, but also told him to make sure and boost his caloric and fluid intake. On Saturday, September 8th, 2024, Costello found himself pedaling into Amarillo, Texas. He was in his second week on the road. His inventory was right on point. He and Avery had a seamless relationship. His GPS network was briefing him on their flawless tracking. Candace was keeping her distance and checking in from time to time. He'd had a few philosophical moments during some rough battles with fatigue, but looking at the landscape in Texas gave him the confidence he needed to ready himself for the next big push. His mind was focused on the achievement and nothing else. He was filled with light and ready to face his next challenge.